Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is David Bjorst. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society, and we're going to have a great panel for you today. I'd like to start by thanking our gracious hosts and my co-organizer, Carolyn, Nguyen, and Microsoft, for having the vision and the energy and the insight to help put together such a great series and such a great concluding event. Yeah. I'm quite proud to have helped organize such a great panel and such an important series with such a prestigious panel and a substantive panel on such an important and pressing topic. Can you imagine if we looked back in 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, and thought, well, we kind of blew it. The internet isn't connected globally anymore. I can't connect with anybody anytime. And that's kind of what this series has been about, highlighting what the risks of fragmentation are and looking at possible solutions and scenarios. One thing is certain, though, that we will need to come together as a community and highlight what those risks are and what the possible solutions are as we try and connect the next billion people and the next 50 billion devices. The challenges are growing day by day, and they will only get bigger, and the only way to really maintain and evolve the internet is by bridging the gaps that exist between the technical community and policy and other areas and different cultural values and how they manifest in policy. I'd like to turn the microphone over to my gracious co-host, Carolyn Nguyen, who will now introduce the panel. I'd also like to thank ISOC for their help and support in putting all of this together. And I'd like to mention that over the next year, ISOC chapters in the North American Bureau and ISOC DC will be developing an internet policy forum to better engage communities, present solutions, and produce more tangible outputs that can help drive these conversations in more productive ways. Thank you all for coming, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for coming here today to join us for this part 4. I'm sorry, unfortunately, there are road closures outside because of the tree lighting ceremony. So, yes, so thank you very much. Two of our panelists had a little bit of issues getting here, and we really appreciate them hustling in order to get here on time. I wanted to really thank the panelists for joining us for this afternoon for this, the concluding series. Wanted to thank David from ISOC DC, who's been a partner in this series, and also for the audience for coming today. Hopefully you're interested in the discussion and not just the reception. And also for anyone who joined us online, we really appreciate that as well. So I'd like to introduce our panelists and then frame the discussion a little bit in terms of, the series, what we're hoping to achieve in this discussion. So you have everyone's bios. I'll just do a very quick introduction. They're seated in in speaking order. Right to my left is Andrew Sullivan, who is a fellow at DINE and also chair of the Internet Architecture Board. From his work at DINE, his specialties include distributed data systems, including the all-important domain name systems, internet protocols, and internet internationalization. The IAB is a really important body because it provides long-range technical directions for internet development to ensure that the internet will continue to grow and evolve as a platform for global communications and innovation. So Andrew's perspective and his experience from that will be really, really helpful for this discussion. Next to that, we have Micaela Klein, who is the Senior Advisor for Internet Policy from the U.S. Department of State. She leads the Office of International Communications and Information Policy activities related to international internet-related public policy, and she advances U.S. policies in international meetings and will be sharing with us some of her experiences in those global meetings today. One of the things that I should say up front is I'm particularly grateful for the panel because each one of them represent a unique stakeholder within the conversation. So Andrew from the technical community, Micaela from the government. Next, we have Cheryl Miller, who's the Director of International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Verizon. Cheryl is engaged in internet governance issues and also emerging technologies such as the IoT in Global Policy Forum that includes the Internet Governance Forum and ICANN as well as others. And Cheryl represents the private sector's perspective. Next, we have Sally Wentworth. There was a change, a last-minute change in our panel. Kathy Brown, unfortunately, was not able to make it, and we are thrilled to have Sally, who is the Vice President of Global Policy Development from the Internet Society. Sally is really the organization's lead in public policy activities to promote development of global policies, to support a global open internet, and the underlying principles. Sally has broad and also very deep expertise and policy experience that includes times at the USG as well as the UN. She's sort of the stalwart defender of the open internet in a lot of these global discussions. And then we have Nathan White, who's the Senior Legislative Manager from accessnow, representing the civil society's perspective. accessnow is an organization that is devoted to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world, a very, very important set of issues, especially as we start to look at internet fragmentation. And then from Paris, joining us, we have Jeremy West, who is the Senior Policy Analyst from the OECD Digital Economy Policy Division. The OECD has been well known for its evidence-based approach on policy development, and in particular, the work that Jeremy has been doing with respect to analyzing the economic and social effects of internet openness will provide really valuable insights to the discussion on internet fragmentation. So, and Jeremy will be representing the international governmental organization and perspectives and some of the policies there. So in framing the discussion, I want to give you a little bit of background about the series. When David and I first discussed this idea, our objectives were really to bring together the different stakeholders, like the representatives that you have in the panelists today, to really examine and create awareness of internet fragmentation issues. And our hope is really to use those insights to inform policy development. And so during the Business Lens discussion, Bob Pepper presented a framework that really helped us crystallize our objective much better, which is what we should aim to do is to enable well-informed stakeholders who are motivated to develop policies that are well-intentioned. So if you look at that as a 2x2, intention and inform, what we're aiming to do here is really to get the conversation towards well-informed, and hopefully by discussing the impact of some of the policy decisions, hopefully motivate well-intentioned policy development. So that's really the framing, and that's how we're thinking about the policy discussion today. With that, we proposed the following points for further discussion on today's panel, and they were really driven by two speakers from our opening session. Ambassador Sepulveda put forth that an open internet is the backbone of the digital economy, and Kathy Brown, who's the president and CEO of Internet Society, clearly said there are two major sources of fragmentation: lack of connectivity for the remaining 4.4 billion and the lack of trust. So with that as the context, and through the series, we hypothesized and proposed the following points, and we'll ask each of the panelists to speak further and expand on these points. Firstly, it is essential to maintain an open, end-to-end, secure, stable, and resilient internet network infrastructure. And for those who are technical in the room, that means layers 3 and 4. As the internet continues to expand and also enable affordable and ubiquitous access to the internet globally, and I'll ask Andrew to speak on that in a little bit. Secondly, creation of locally sustainable ecosystems to realize a successful digital economy and many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals really depend on this foundation. However, differing views on issues that include privacy, security, and IP can drive government policy and regulations that can lead to fragmentation of the internet and thus impact the economic and human rights. Trust will be a major issue to address and mitigate that. And then, so enabling well-informed and well-intentioned policy development, which does require policy stakeholders to have additional dialogues to develop a more holistic view that can balance the economic and human rights with national government concerns. So that's really our hypothesis for this discussion. And what we'll do with the opening discussion is I'll pose a question to each one of the panelists and ask for their perspectives. So Andrew, as you know, really, I think probably the most technical person on the panel, and the chair of the IAB, can you help us address some of the challenges in maintaining this, open, end-to-end, resilient, secure, stable internet network infrastructure, especially as the internet continues to grow and expand, and also the role of standards that are developed in open consensus-based voluntary organizations such as the IETF?
Sure. So first of all, before I start, I have to say this. I am the chair of the IAB, but I don't speak for them. And they get very, very grouchy if I don't tell everybody that, so I have to tell you that. And the IAB does produce some statements from time to time, and then you know that they're all in agreement. But today I'm speaking just for myself. So there are a couple of things that I want to touch on here. The first one is that we've talked a little bit about this middle layer, and in particular the layers 3 and 4. And for those who aren't familiar with the network layers, it's all very boring. But for those who are familiar with it, there are these distinct layers which are mostly mythical, because in fact in actual deployments these things are frequently intermingled in ways that are maybe not as clean as an architectural diagram would suggest. And one of the interesting things that is happening, in fact, is that's a moving target right now. So historically, what tended to happen was that there were these low-level things called transport layers that were inside the kernel, basically, of your operating system. So the very brain, the reptile brain of your computer, or of your phone, or whatever you like. And what we're doing with protocols like QUIC, which is a thing that's currently being developed, but is also already deployed on the internet by Google. You may have heard of Google. They have deployed this stuff already. So if you're using Chrome today, you will sometimes be using this protocol. And it has moved the transport layer into the application, which means that we are changing the network in such a way that it no longer is multi-year updates to your operating system that changes the transport that you're using, but instead the nightly build that you get from your browser vendor that may change the transport. And this radically alters the environment in which we are working. And so this means that the speed at which this thing can move is much greater. So why is that important for this discussion? Well, the fundamental fact here is that if you don't have interoperation, you don't have an internet, right? I mean, we call it an internet because it's a network of networks, et cetera, all the way down. And the key piece of that is that without open standards, without standards that anybody can take and implement and use independently of one another, and implement those without pre-existing agreements, you don't have an internet. What you have is a proprietary network that goes end to end. We had lots and lots of those in the past, and over time we discovered that there was value instead in having this freely connectable network in which you could connect and you could exchange packets with anybody else without a prior contractual relationship between you and everybody else involved. Contrast that, for instance, with, say, the old phone system or early time-sharing systems or whatever, right? You had to have a contract all the way to the other end, or you had to have a contractual relationship with somebody else who had a contractual relationship to the person all the way to the other end. And if you wanted to use, some other phone system than the Bell system back when there was another phone system than the Bell system. Then you had a different phone on your desk, and it was a whole different system, and you were connected to it. That's not the way the internet works, and that is part of the way that it was designed to solve that kind of problem. But it means that at the very bottom, to go back to your question, at the very bottom you have to have these open standards. And if you don't have them, you can't do internet working, because in that case it's not internet working, right? It's just one network. I think that the danger that we are facing to a certain extent is that we've forgotten that that's what the internet is, that there is sort of in a public way of talking. I've started to notice this, right? People keep correcting what I write because they keep making a lowercase I on the beginning of internet, because the AP or somebody like that did that. And this is actually a technical mistake, right? It's a mistake of misunderstanding that an internet of just a bunch of computers that are using different technologies and talking to each other is one thing. But the internet with the capital I is actually a proper noun. And it's a proper noun because it's the emergent property of all of these other things. There's one more thing that I'll just touch on, and then somebody else can talk. Because if you let me go, you have to kick me, right? There is one other thing, though, and that is when I first was thinking about this, I thought, oh, fragmentation is such a big deal, and I was thinking about that a great deal. And then I realized that in some important sense, the internet was designed to be fragmented all the way along. That is, it has the property where the only value of what internet working is if I can send a packet to you, and if you can send a packet back to me. And that fact is a mutual benefit that we all get. And everybody on the internet benefits from the fact that we allow that as much as possible. But it was never a monolithic thing. It was always possible that different parts of it were a little bit broken. Back in the very early days, the domain name system, for instance, the reason you had multiple name servers and you had caching and time to live, it was not so that, pages could load faster. It was because things broke all the time. Stuff shut down. People unplugged their computers. There's a famous story about one site that they couldn't understand why it was going off every night, and finally they called it up when it went off, and the janitor picked up the phone. And what he'd been doing, of course, is unplugging the computer in order to plug his vacuum in, and that was why that site went off the air every night. That's the way the internet grew, and we still see those pieces of it inside. So it's tolerant of fragmentation. It just won't tolerate complete fragmentation.
Thanks, Andrew. Is there anyone else who would like to add to that? Okay. I want to go back to a point that you made, which is, the internet is about interoperability, which requires open standards and which requires standards to continue to evolve and innovation to continue to happen. Ask Micaela the question on, it seems like there are increasingly blurring of lines between what are standards developed according to the way that Andrew described and regulations. And that so there seems to be sort of two models. One is where protocols are developed through the technical community, voluntary consensus-based, and one's where standards are developed more to dictate regulations that may actually lead more to fragmentation. Can you address this a little bit further, especially from the work that you've been doing?
Sure, and I think that the question is pretty timely, especially since we just returned from an ITU meeting, the International Telecommunication Union, which is a specialized UN agency that addresses telecommunications networks and has more recently gotten involved with information and communication technologies more broadly. And it was a meeting it was called the World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly, which occurs, I think a lot of people in this room are familiar, but basically it happens every 4 years, and it reviews the work program and decides what's coming next for the standardization sector of the ITU. And I think this is the example of the WTSA and the ITU-T, especially as a organization that is struggling to a certain extent to balance the reality that it was established for, which was really a system of traditional telephone networks that required or that saw some value in having a more top-down process by governments who, where there was some requirements by governments to establish interconnection agreements and various types of interoperability to make sure that phone calls could occur across the seas, across state lines, things like that. And there was some value in having standards that were that actually helped assisted that kind of interoperability. Now that organization and the same group of people would like to figure out how to evolve into then being able to support the internet and standards that are related to information and communication technologies. And what we're seeing is a real tension between this desire for governments to figure out different ways of having more of a top-down process and this more organic process that Andrew was discussing through a bottom-up multi-stakeholder process where that actually responds more flexibly to the requirements of the technology. And so on the one hand, you have governments that are searching to solve both public policy challenges and perhaps technical challenges sometimes using what they call standards, but in some cases are more like precursors to regulation, as Carolyn was describing, and the actual standards that are required by the technology. And it is a real friction. Sometimes this is happening not because of of bad motivation. It's not that governments are looking to control everything. There are legitimate concerns that governments are facing, that citizens are facing, and governments are trying to be responsive to those concerns and using the traditional ways that they know how to do things, going to the UN and the top-down processes that they are very familiar with. And they're having a difficult time evolving and participating in venues like the IETF, for example, or other kinds of multi-stakeholder venues where governments have this, a government representative has the exact same degree of clout as just an internet user. And that's very difficult to say to a government that has to coordinate all of our positions and talking points and comes representing a national position and saying that, a user, an internet user from another country, or can really just debate and part of that is the beauty of the internet, and part of that's a real frustration, I think, for a lot of governments. Some of the other motivations, I think, that we're seeing with this trend are related to real friction between just the convergence of services. I think one thing that we saw, especially at the WTSA, was a lot of the people who participate in the ITU, for example, are telecom regulators who have lost a lot of revenue over the last several years because of the introduction of new services that have replaced the telephone, for example, and that go over the top of the network. And so those are, various types of communications applications. Since we're at Microsoft, Skype is a good example. WhatsApp, things, different communications like that. And they're not seeing the same kinds of revenue for their operators and for their citizenship as they used to. And so in some cases, they're using technical standards to try to, or regulation to try to advance that. What was kind of interesting at the WTSA in particular was there's a perception, I think, even though most of the proposals that we were seeing related to over-the-top services, for example, data privacy, cybersecurity, many of the proposals were political rather than technical. Which for a technical, more telecommunications standardization body is not really what it's supposed to be focused on. But to me, in addition to demonstrating, the need for, some of the challenges related to convergence, some of the challenges related to revenue and public policy challenges, is also a conception that there is something that public policy challenges are occurring because there's something that is wrong with the internet or wrong with the network. So rather than recognizing these things as the same kinds of challenges that we've dealt with in the physical world that are now going on the online world, they're saying, well, there must be something that's broken about the internet, and that maybe we need to shut down the bad parts of the internet, or we need to do, there's different kinds of language that's being used, and we're seeing that same language increasingly being used by national governments, and things like privacy and crime and are being used as both excuses, but also as explanations for why they're making certain choices related to regulation and standardization. The last thing that I'll mention is related to not so much the what we're seeing in the ITU, but also what we're seeing as just worldwide trends. I think there's real fear of being left behind. I think that many developing countries in particular have felt left behind by the internet. That the internet, and even when you go to an IETF meeting or to an ICANN meeting, there's a lot of people from the West, and Western companies really do dominate a lot of both the policy discussions, but also the markets. And I think that with a lot of emerging technologies like Internet of Things, like artificial intelligence, even just the deployment of 5G, they are seeing a new opportunity for their private sectors and for their own countries to suddenly get a piece of this internet game. And so they want to create standards that favor their private sectors or that favor their own development. And so rather than necessarily doing what is right for the global internet, they're making choices, and they're thinking about ways to ensure that they're not left out of this new phase of development. And so I think that is certainly leading to those choices, although no single choice is going to fragment the internet or break the internet. I think those are all choices that we have to be wary of and that are going to be contributing going forward.
Thanks, Micaela. Lots of insights and lots of things that we need to unpack from your statement there. But one of the things that I do want to pick up on is your comment with respect to these choices that are leading to the fragmentation of the internet. So if we want to continue the conversation along the well-informed part of it, I want to pose the next question to Jeremy and ask about, so if the internet were to fragment, what would be some of the social and economic impact? And in particular, for Jeremy to share some of the analytics that he has done to look at, the current, how traffic is actually currently flowing to enable the growth of this digital economy as well. So Jeremy? No, we can hear you fine. There's no echo.
Okay, all right, fine. So thank you. My colleague Sarah Box and I wrote a paper earlier this year that began the exploration at the OECD of the economic and social benefits of internet openness. So we came at this more from the perspective of how does openness help rather than how does fragmentation hurt. But in many ways, this is just two different approaches to the same issue. Ultimately, what we wanted to do was to persuade policymakers that openness matters and that they should pay careful attention to it when they're making policies, because more of it brings benefits and less of it brings costs. I want to emphasize, however, that this was kind of dipping our toe in the water. It was the first step. That was the main contribution was to set up a framework for further work that I hope we will do. So while we did succeed in making some building blocks here, more work is needed. So I'll start with the findings on economic impact. And to start with, I'll say that we did do some empirical work here at the OECD, but what we did was limited to measuring openness itself, rather than the next step of tying openness to economic benefits. So I'm going to skip over the measurement of openness and get to the benefits part, since that's what the question is about. And for that, what we had to do is look at existing literature that was already out there and kind of summarize it. So for evidence on the economic benefits that flow from openness, we looked at three broad categories of economic activity. And that was international trade, innovation and entrepreneurship, and productivity and growth. And there were varying degrees of evidence out there on the connection between openness and those things. So I'll start with international trade. And what we found, just to give it, put a hat on this, is that the power of internet openness to boost trade is closely tied to the rise of global value chains, which rely on data flows to coordinate their activities across different countries. So being able to move data freely between countries seamlessly is an essential part of the value that GVCs bring. And then if you want to look at it from a fragmentation perspective, that means that reductions or more fragmentation could substantially interfere with the value that GVCs are bringing. So the benefits to trade don't only come from GVCs, but that was a big part of it. And to cherry pick some examples, I pulled a few out of our report, starting with a study on the potential external trade impact of the EU's proposed general data privacy regulation. This was a study done by something called the European Center for International Political Economy in 2013. And they concluded that about 600 billion US dollars of EU services trade, that's billion with a B, could depend on the openness of the digital economy. And to put that in perspective, that's about 6 times the value, the total value of European car exports. So it was a huge number. And then that same center also built a model estimating that if the safe harbor framework were revoked, now I'll take a step aside there. In case you don't know what the safe harbor framework was, this was a legal framework that allowed companies to send data back and forth between the EU and the US, even though technically the United States didn't meet the legal requirements under European law as a country that adequately protected privacy. So companies would voluntarily sign up and certify that they met the standards. But then the European Court of Justice wound up invalidating that framework. So this European Center for International Political Economy built a model estimating that framework were revoked. It could reduce U.S. service exports to the EU by 0.2 to 0.5%, which may not sound like a lot in percentage terms, but if you look at how much money that represents, it's a lot. And then for EU firms, they predicted a drop in services exports of 0.6 to a full percentage point, and that would be due to a loss of competitiveness. I don't want to take too much time here. I'm conscious I've got a lot of these little nuggets to share with you, but I'm afraid they'll take too much time. So I want to move on to innovation and entrepreneurship, where it's mainly the Internet's ability to act as a massive connector that's behind openness's positive effects. And so the literature points to the importance of the Internet in enabling knowledge flows that support innovation. And here you have to look at the evidence in steps, starting with evidence that innovation is often a collaborative process among firms, scientists, and inventors. And here the OECD does have something called the Science, Technology, and Industry Scoreboard, which shows a strong and positive correlation between how much international collaboration exists in a country's institutions and the impact of the scientific publications that come out of that country's institutions as measured by citations in journals. And then next we found some evidence that digital technologies in fact do support collaboration, and there are studies in our report cited for that. And then more evidence, again from our scoreboard, showing the large and growing extent around the OECD to which firms are making use of internet-based tools, such as cloud computing, supply chain management, having a website, crowd financing, etc. And these internet-based tools are making them more efficient, and the benefits apply across all different kinds of firms. So, for example, in 2015, the firm Deloitte found that the ability to target and then fine-tune advertising through Facebook's insights into user characteristics gives them a more cost-effective way to market. More than 30 million SMEs had established Facebook pages by the middle of 2014, and more than 1.5 million businesses were actively using Facebook's targeted advertising system. Those numbers have probably gone up in the last couple of years. Still, quantitative evidence that specifically highlights the connection between openness in stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship is scarce. There's more that's just about the internet in general. However, there is a rare example that comes from a consulting firm called Dahlberg. They found a clear and positive correlation between internet and openness and innovation outputs, basically by plotting countries' scores using the Freedom House, Freedom on the Net Index, and the Global Innovation Index. For productivity and growth, just to cut this one short, there's very little out there. We found very little empirical evidence, even though we think there should be evidence that the greater diffusion of innovations and within and across countries that comes with openness should have a role in promoting greater productivity and growth. About the closest thing that we could come up with, or that I could come up with in my search for tonight, was a 2011 study that the OECD did that took a look at a 5-day internet shutdown by the government of Egypt in 2011. And we just were estimating the direct costs to the internet and communication sector, and we found that there was a cost of $90 million over those 5 days to that sector. But this didn't take into account all the other sectors that depend on that. So if you're looking for this kind of information, Darrell West at Brookings just released a report in October estimating the total cost of government internet shutdowns across all countries for all of last year, and the figure was $2.4 billion US. Now, to get to the social impact of openness, this area is so much harder to measure for a bunch of reasons, including that we're not really measuring units, convenient units anymore, like dollars or euros, but you're talking about how much people like something or enjoy something, or the personal value they put on it. So what we did in this part of the paper was to just identify different kinds of social benefits from openness, and there are many, and put together some qualitative evidence for them. The idea being just to show that these benefits do exist and they are real and meaningful, even though we couldn't reduce it to numbers, at least not yet. So to give you just a glimpse, the benefits include more educational opportunities, for example, in the form of MOOCs or massive open online courses like Khan Academy, more freedom of association and facilitation of democracy. For example, political demonstrations that are now organized and broadcast with the help of smartphones connected to the internet. Aiding humanitarian causes, like helping refugees to get safely from one place to another. And then simpler things, just like making it easier and more convenient to stay in touch with family and friends. These things have a huge value that's unfortunately very hard to measure. And there are many, many more: medical research, transparency in government, etc. I could give you a couple of my personal favorites, but I don't want to take too much time. So maybe if there's time later, I can go back to that. I do want to mention that the question, I think, is about impact of openness. So that includes drawbacks as well. And we did acknowledge in the report that there can be some some downsides to openness. It can be used for harmful purposes by bad actors. People who want to use internet openness to help them commit crimes, for example, or to broadcast extremist views, or things like, everybody uses the example of child pornography, etc., things that are universally looked at as bad things. The last part of the question was about our upcoming work. We have an enormous project coming up over the next 2 years on digitalization, specifically helping policymakers to seize the benefits of digitalization for growth and well-being. So this is going to be a lot broader than just internet openness, although that could be part of it. In particular, the work is going to address a message we heard loud and clear earlier this year in our Cancun ministerial on the digital economy, which is that governments want help in measuring the digital economy so they can make better decisions about it. We are going to be very collaborative in this effort, bringing in lots of stakeholders from outside the OECD, as well as experts from across the house internally. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for putting out there also some of the evidence-based and some of the facts around this conversation that have been missing. And as you've pointed out, there's very, very little evidence, concrete evidence out there at the level that the OECD is developing. So definitely looking forward to continuing to see the research being released and providing, again, kind of moving us along that well-informed access towards policy making. One of the points that Jeremy made, which is about the internet enabling knowledge flow, and also the internet really enabling SMEs. I think that these are crucial and critical towards the development of the digital economy, or the ecosystems that can drive the digital economy, as well as the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I want to turn to Cheryl as an expert in these areas, and also from the private sector, to address this impact in a little bit more detail.
Sure. Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you to Microsoft and ISOC for really taking leadership on this issue. It's a really important issue, and I think that this is a great series to start, and I hope that there'll be continued discussion as well along these lines. So when you use the word fragmentation, I think what most people envision is this image of the global public internet being balkanized, right, for lack of a better word. So you're talking about digitally bordered national internets. And what does that mean? What are some of the challenges that come along with that? So you might have barriers to certain technical functions, or you might have certain types of rules that would block the flow of content. Earlier this year, I was actually reading a report by the World Economic Forum that I thought was quite a good report. I think it came out in January, and they arranged these different issues into 6 buckets that I think are applicable. So the first bucket was content and censorship, and it touches along some of what Micaela was talking about, and also another panel, I forget who else mentioned this, but each of the buckets, that you can see that there's a tension, if you will, or a balance. So for example, free flow of information versus perhaps national sovereignty. What's protected in the United States under freedom of speech may not be protected somewhere else in the world under the same standards. Second bucket, e-commerce and trade. There's a tension between the openness and wealth creation. And wealth creation is something that's in the interest of every country. National security, obvious bucket, tough bucket, right? Privacy and data protection, also very complicated bucket, because the notion of privacy has so many cultural undertones and other undertones as well that go along with it. Data localization and connectivity, and this is something that I want to come back to and place a bigger emphasis on as well. And fragmentation as an overarching national strategy, right? So that's sort of the range of the different areas where the challenges can arise. So Verizon, for I think everyone in the room has heard of our company. We're a global company, and we always say we're a part of the network of networks, right? Everyone in this room is a part of the network of networks. We're all playing different roles, but we all definitely have our own part. And one of the main areas where we've been really innovating in and trying to be disruptive to ourselves as a company has been with the Internet of Things. Internet of Things is a really hot buzzword these days. It's actually not something new. I'm sure many people in this room have been working on it for 20 years plus, right? But we're at a point now where analysts are predicting that the growth is becoming so exponential, we could go from millions of things to possibly 20 billion by 2020. In order for that to happen, though, there needs to be certain policies in place, certain infrastructure, certain investment, et cetera. And why is the Internet of Things so important beyond just connecting things and connecting stuff, right? Well, I think that there's a really important link to this work to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll touch on that in a minute. So the challenges that can be imposed in this area by fragmentation, there are multiple. First of all, as a company, having a minefield of conflicting and confusing rules is difficult. So having a lack of consistency is something that it definitely poses a challenge to rolling out new items, new products, new services. I think public policy concerns as well, just in general, they span borders. You know, public policy concerns that arise in the United States are very similar. They're the same concerns that would be in a country such as France or anywhere else, right? Everyone has interest in protecting their citizens. And so I think as we move forward, there's going to need to be more of an emphasis on working together and coming together to craft sort of global solutions. And I certainly want to applaud ISOC's leadership in doing that and a lot of the work that they've done with respect to the multi-stakeholder model and really helping in that regard. I think data localization rules, you know, they obviously disrupt the seamless communication that's needed for IoT devices just based on the way these devices communicate with each other and respond. But at the same time, Carolyn was talking about economics. It can actually drive up the cost as well. And that's something else to definitely take into consideration. So what are these more specifically? So you can have different licensing requirements, for example, different registration requirements. You can have special country-specific mandates. All these things can impede the growth of IoT. So for those who aren't familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I am very passionate about them, I don't know that I'm an expert in them. I think Carolyn was very generous in saying that. But I really, truly believe in them. I mean, at the end of 2015, over 190 global leaders came together, and they outlined some real things that we need to work on together as a global community. What are these different things? They're nothing new. They're things that we've been struggling with for a long time. For example, ending poverty, ending hunger, making sure everyone has a quality education, providing good jobs and economic growth, creating sustainable cities and communities. I mean, these are all good goals to be striving towards. And I think a lot of individuals and companies and organizations in the room are working toward that. They've been working toward that. In a lot of the different projects that you see that are related to IoT, you'll see that. So for example, one of the things Verizon has been working on has been smart cities. And we really do believe that smart cities are a way to reduce traffic congestion, to create economic benefits, to provide energy efficiency, to prevent food waste, et cetera. There are so many different things that if you bring all of the necessary requirements together, can help you to get that. So we recently purchased a company, it's called Sensity, and they're one of the global leaders actually in smart city development. And we've been really working with them to figure out how do we really do this really well so we can serve as a model for other areas to utilize. And we've also been looking at some of the policy considerations that can impede the growth, not only for smart cities, but for a lot of other things that we're developing. And so I was thinking earlier, and I'm coming up with a couple of, I don't want to just talk about problems, right? That's not helpful. So I've been trying to think of different solutions that we can all discuss. And I'm going through solutions, and I'll stop there because I really want good audience participation. I always hate listening to people and not having a shot to jump in, right? So I think flexible approaches to regulation are important. And I think this goes hand in hand with, I call it the multi-stakeholder approach. Multi-stakeholder is a really fancy word. I think just people coming together and hashing it out, right? I think consistency and interagency coordination is important because now there'll be different areas of different government entities getting involved, for example, in intelligent cars, et cetera. So I think that type of coordination is going to be important, so the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, so to speak. I think the development of best practices is really important, and we're already starting to see the start of that, right? Policies that help to support the open internet. Putting a focus on connectivity. I mean, connectivity is really big. We still have many people that lack basic connectivity, and that's huge, and that's something that we really need to address. Efforts to build trust. Trust is really important. I know ISOC's been doing a lot of work on both the connectivity and trust piece, but it's really important. I can't emphasize enough how important that is. And we're going to need to be working on better efforts to kind of get to where we need to go with trust. Preventing delays in the movement from IPv4 to IPv6, just a simple kind of a technical solution, like preventing blockades to similar efforts, right? And also making sure there aren't local data retention requirements. If we have agreed that we really do want to see these different goals achieved, and we've agreed that technology can help through the advancements of IoT or advancements of other technology, then we need to really think about that. So I'll stop there, and again, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that. I mean, one of the things I love about all the speakers on this panel is that I hope you can see how passionate they are about the topics that they're talking about, and it's not a very high-level conversation. It's very, very concrete with the examples of the recommendations. So thank you very much for that. And Cheryl, also thank you for teeing up the question perfectly for Sally. I think Cheryl, both Cheryl and Jeremy has alluded to the tensions in terms of, differing opinions, different perspectives on, privacy, security, etc. And one way to look at that, and Cheryl has brought it up as well, which is really the need to work together to build up trust, to address and mitigate some of these different in opinions. The Internet Society has done some amazing policy development work, but one of the things that you've done recently is the release of this trust framework. Perhaps I can ask you to talk about that a little bit more, and how do you see the role of that trust framework in hopefully enabling this well-informed and moving towards well-intentioned policy development?
Sure, thanks for that. So as excuse me, as was noted at the Internet Society, we've identified a couple areas that we think are crucial for the Internet to continue to grow and evolve worldwide. The first, which Cheryl spoke about a bit, and Jeremy as well, you have to have fundamental and basic access to the Internet, right? I mean, we need to see that access continue to grow. And that, and we know that the places that still haven't been reached are among the hardest to reach, and so the challenges are really profound in those regions, and truly very important. The other aspect is trust, and we just released a report a couple weeks ago, the Global Internet Report, looking at data breaches and the impact that these persistent data breaches have on end user trust in the network. Every time you get one of those letters in the mail that says, oh, by the way, all of your data that we collected and forgot to tell you that we collected has suddenly been spilled, and you as a user feel fairly powerless to do anything about it. Those of us who used to work in the government got a lovely letter from the United States government telling us that, and at that point you sort of throw up your hands, right? This issue of trust is really fundamental, and as more and more of our lives go online and the requirements for our lives go online. And my parents are telling me that to participate in Medicare, you have to have online banking. You have to do direct deposits. So this is now very real to a very important portion of our society, the elderly in the United States. And some might argue some of the part of a society that might be the least trustful of the technology is being required to depend on it for their very subsistence. So these things matter fundamentally, whether or not we trust that the way our data is being handled, the routing and the fundamental architecture of the Internet, is it secure at every level of the transaction? That this is crucial for the Internet to really grow and become the thing that we want it to be. And in societies where they're still making those steps, do we want to be online? Do we actually want to participate in the e-commerce, global e-commerce network? Do we want to be part of the Internet of Things? Do we want to put our entire sets of industries into this environment? If they don't trust it, they're not going to make those kinds of decisions, right? So we have to deal with this, and we have to deal with it head on. One of the issues that's often brought to me from developing countries in particular is, you know, Sally, we don't have the equivalent of 1,800 people at the Federal Communications Commission that you have in the United States, or a huge bureaucracy that you see, a consumer protection bureaucracy like you see in the European Union. We can do 3 or 4 things. That's realistic for us. And we don't have this wonderful, beautiful multi-stakeholder community that you talk about in the United States or in developed countries. We don't have that. We may not have the technical expertise in our civil society. We may not have it in our industry if we're dependent upon international industry. We may not have the local expertise. So we can't do everything. And so there's this tension that I think is emerging, and your panel, or your topic, tees it up very interestingly. On the one hand, a lot of us go around and we say, a single international treaty is not the solution to your problems, right? You know, writing a law and saying, you know, the internet shall be secure as of next Tuesday is not going to solve your security problems. On the other hand, we also say we don't want to see fragmentation. We don't want to see all these these specific national laws popping up all over the world that make it difficult for companies like Verizon or otherwise to function across borders. So there's this interesting discussion on one of ISOC's mailing lists about a small island country that wrote a cybercrime law and did it on the basis of some best practices, and everybody's now going apoplectic about whether or not they should have done that. And if you're a regulator sitting in that country, you say, what is it? You don't want me to have a treaty, and now I wrote a national law and you're upset about that too. What do I do? So I think this is something we, as the internet community here in the United States, I think we have to come to terms with this a little bit. We are sending some mixed messages. And it is hard for countries that are looking at the complexity of the network that Andrew described, the demands of their citizens to use it, to grow it, to be part of it, and the legal frameworks that are really hard to develop. So the trust framework that ISOC put together was an effort to at least put some construct around how we look at trust. And we looked at trust in 4 dimensions, and we try to present this for policymakers as a way to say, here's a way to think about how you might develop policies in these areas. And not all of these require laws. I think that's an important point. Policy doesn't necessarily have to be law. But one is around user trust. So what are the policies and what are the elements, the principles that need to be in place for user trust? Obviously, there's a big human rights consideration, right? The ability to communicate securely, to express opinions without censorship. The confidentiality of your communication. Can you send that communication in a way that is secure and not tampered with? The privacy considerations for end users are important. Consumer protection rules. Redress, the ability to hold somebody accountable for your data breach, for example. Transparency in policymaking. Do I, as an end user, understand how rules and laws related to security and trust are being developed? There's more to it, but that's a bucket of issues related to the specific interests of the end user. Importantly, the end user is not always just me or Cheryl or Carol. It's an end user could be an entity, right? Verizon is an end user. Walmart can be an end user. So it's the users of the network. So it's important not to think of users only as people, but as could be organizations or entities. The second group of issues that we looked at were the technologies that enable trust. So these are not, again, this goes to things that are not necessarily in law, but that can be either advanced or impeded by law. So encryption, of course, is the big issue of the day. Everyone's talking about it. It is a technology for trust. It can be enabled by policy. It can be constrained by policy. And there's a big debate, of course, in the United States and elsewhere about the extent to which law enforcement wants to see constraints put on encryption. But there are these technologies that enable trust, that help end users ensure that the communication they have is confidential. They can authenticate the other party to the communication. They understand that the transport of their communication was secure. And these technologies are developed in a host of standards organizations, among them the IETF, but elsewhere, to ensure that, that as your communication travels across the network, that it is secure. And policymakers, I think, need to understand that these technologies, not just a button. You're not just pushing a button and saying it's now all secure end to end. It requires a series of building blocks. And those building blocks are better for the end user. They are better for governments, better for policymakers when they are developed in an open standards environment. When you can bring all of the resources, all of the expertise to the table and develop things that are truly robust. The third area is trusted networks. This is really about the transport. How do you get from A to B? And can you be confident that your transaction, that your communication is secure? And again, there's a policy component to this. Governments have always been interested in traffic routing, for better or for worse. There is an aspect of that that is policy related. There's also a lot of best practices that go along with this. ISOC has an initiative called Manners, which goes to routing security, but really looks at the fact that if I'm an operator, I am in an ecosystem, and my behavior within that ecosystem affects everybody else's security in that ecosystem. So I'm just not a lone actor here. I depend on the security practices of others, and they depend on the security practices of me. And so that network routing infrastructure is really quite important. And then the fourth component of the trusted framework is the trusted ecosystem itself. How are decisions made with respect to trust in all of those areas that I just described? Do I, as a participant in the ecosystem, understand and have access to those decisions? If I'm affected by the trusted technologies, can I participate in the IETF or the W3C or elsewhere? Do I have confidence the way those decisions are being made? Do I understand my policy environment? Is the policy being made in a closed system? Some of us would argue that even in countries like the United States and elsewhere, there is a long way to go to make the regulatory systems actually multi-stakeholder and accessible. The current regulatory systems around the world are still very structured around the old telecommunications model. And they're very accessible to people in the telecommunications system, but not so much to the other parts of the ecosystem that are affected by the decisions that are made. So I think there's work to be done to make the ecosystem actually trusted. And this all sounds very abstract, but when you come down to it, there is a tendency among policymakers, again, to say, if I push a button, can I make this secure? If I write a law or put a line in the international telecommunication regulations or somewhere, will the network suddenly be secure and I can go off and do something else? And I think the answer to that is no, obviously. There is a lot of complexity. On the other hand, I think we as a community have to grapple with the fact that small countries in particular have real honest-to-goodness challenges in developing the kinds of policies that are needed, and the lack of expertise available to them in their local environment. And it's not enough to say, multi-stakeholder. We really have to do more and do better if we want people to trust this ecosystem.
Great. Thanks, Sally, for putting forward that framework, which I think provides a practical, a more sort of practical approach towards constructing some of these policies that are necessary. I want to now turn to Nathan. One of the things that I think the trust framework does is it puts together sort of the larger framework. And human rights is such a critical aspect of this. One of our previous speakers had said that, really human rights is a combination of economic rights as well as freedom of expression. So, Nathan, perhaps you can help us to better understand what is the impact, what do you see as the impact of internet fragmentation on human rights?
Sure.
Sort of on that.
First of all, just let me say thank you to you and David for inviting me, Microsoft and the Internet Society. It's great to be here. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I'm very grateful to be speaking last so I can echo what the smart people have already said and then look good by comparison. I am from a human rights organization, so we look at this through the lens of human rights. And from our perspective, the internet is a powerful tool for the expression of those human rights, whether it's the freedom of association, the freedom of information, or the freedom of expression. The fact that the internet is a holistic global entity amplifies those rights. I have a greater freedom of association with somebody in Gambia or even North Korea if I'm able to connect with them and speak with them and share information with them. So almost by definition, fragmenting the internet is going to harm human rights and impair the expression of the human rights, particularly expression and association. And if you think about it, nobody's trying to break apart the internet, whether it's at the app layer or the transportation layer, in order to have greater human rights. Micaela mentioned there's some economic incentive to do so, but generally it's in response to things that governments do that are generally not great for human rights. And the example a lot of us are talking about right now is Facebook entering the Chinese market. Facebook has to redesign its system to be able to participate in the Chinese legal structure, which requires them to be able to give information about how the users are using that network. That means not just people in China, but also how people in China are speaking with people not in China. So the way that I look at the world is a little bit different than the way that the governments and the corporations look at the world. And you can get this from the emails we send out. If you're ever on the activist email list, we are the ones who are sending you the email saying, so-and-so is going to break the internet. Micaela said it's not usually one thing, but we like to boil it down to one thing every now and then. And sometimes it's Verizon, sometimes it's the State Department, and usually it's the FCC though. But we look at the internet as actually a pretty fragile thing. If you think about it, we have hundreds of companies, thousands of companies, hundreds of regulators, millions of users who all came together and said, let's use the same standards because it works better for all of us if it's a single internet with a big I. That is an incentive structure that was put in place that created this wonderful thing called the internet, and it's so great for all of us to use. We carry it in our pockets, and it helps us express our human rights. We worry about creating incentives that break that up, that whether it's from a financial perspective or whether it's a government perspective or a user perspective, we don't want incentives where people are going to say, well, I'm going to go off and I'm going to create my own internet, or I'm going to create my own application or device that we're only going to use in this part of the world. An example that we talk about all the time right now is encryption. That I think the US in particular has failed to lead on encryption, and so now we have these different proposals around the world. China actually said, we're going to pass a law on encryption because the United States has failed to lead on this issue. And so now companies are saying, do we build one device that we're going to sell in China? Do we create one network that we're going to use in China, and then another device that we're going to use everywhere else in the world? Are we going to do a third device for Russia, a fourth device for Gambia? Or are we going to have one device that's very insecure that we're going to use around the world? By the very nature, we've created an incentive structure which starts to break apart and fragment the internet, and human rights are going to be harmed. Another specific example is, again, I'm picking on China apparently today. China has a draft rule that says if you're going to register a domain, you have to have a real name and it has to have an entity within the territorial borders of China. That is a different way of looking at the world, and it's required VeriSign to already build the technical infrastructure in order to be able to do that. That leads to the second point, which Cheryl, you mentioned already, of data localization laws. When you start saying we need the data in our country, whether it's because we don't want the Five Eyes or the NSA spying on our citizens, or whether we want our own law enforcement to have access to the data, when you pass data localization laws, you are forcing companies to make policies and business decisions to put their data there. That's creating an economic incentive and just a simple doing business incentive to either not go into those markets, or to pick and choose where you're going to be, or to create subsidiaries that only operate in those markets, further creating fragmentation on the network. And the third thing that I want to mention is actually the polar opposite of data localization, and that's ignoring borders altogether. Right now, law enforcement in particular has a problem of we don't know where this data exists. We don't know where this email exists. I know people around here are thinking about that. So there's conversations about why don't we let our courts establish a warrant so that a company in another country has to give us the information. Sounds fairly reasonable, but what we're doing there is we're creating an incentive structure where you're going to push data to different places. If everyone in the world agreed to a warrant status or a warrant requirement that we support here in the United States, that might be great. We might be lifting the world up to a higher standard for security and privacy. But it's probably not going to be that way. It's probably going to be a race to the bottom of where can law enforcement go to get the easiest access to the information that they're trying to get. That's their incentive. They want the information. Perfectly reasonable. But that creates the incentive for me to say, all right, well, if I'm using a UK company and I know that their courts are able to get the information directly from the US government or vice versa, I might be more inclined to use a product or service that is hosting my data in Germany because I know it will be more protected. Again, we're creating incentives whereby, in this case, the users are going to want to fragment the internet. So it's a scary world, but the way we look at it is the internet is a great thing, but it's actually really fragile, and we need to be careful that we're not creating incentives for anybody to want to walk away from the table, because it only exists because we're all working together. We're all saying, let's use these common standards. And so I think everybody sort of mentioned it, but the goal probably has to be at the end of the day more multi-stakeholder in whatever form that takes so that we're all staying at the table. Other organizations, other countries, other areas of the world might need more support to be at the table, but we need to make sure that we're all making the decisions together, because the alternative is the internet starts breaking apart, and from my perspective, that will have detrimental impacts on human rights around the world.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for that. So what you've all done for me is just put out a tremendous, lots of nuances, lots of issues that have to be addressed to get to that, sort of level of well-informed, right? And one of the things that Sally has made very clear is it's not possible to get to the point of being well-informed in some governments because of restrictions, et cetera. So if we want to get to the vision, Nathan said, we all need to work together, and sort of all need to sit at the table, or more prosaically, we framed it as, well-intentioned policy development. What are some of the things that, what's the call to action, right? And there's also, the other thing that I hear from all of you is there's a long list of issues that will need to be addressed. So what's the call to action? And from your perspective, are there prioritized issues? Is that how we approach it, or do we approach it more as a framework, like what Sally has put forth? As each of you, I'm going to ask everyone to respond with Micaela taking the lead. But as you give your response, also I want to think about from your specific stakeholders, so the technical community, industry, civil society. What are some of the things that you'd recommend be done? So think of this as the call to action. Micaela?
Great. So I don't have the benefit of being able to follow all these smart people, so I guess I'll kick it off. So I think that there are several different. I think it's hard to say that there's one thing that rises to the top priority to do here, but I think there are several different things that are going to be really important going forward, so that to continue to promote openness, to continue to promote sort of multi-stakeholder cooperation, and to ensure that we're able to continue to reap the benefits of the economic and social benefits that the internet brings. So I think the first one, many people have already said it, is connectivity. We need to continue to prioritize connecting the unconnected around the world, closing the digital divide. And I think an important component of that is not just ensuring that they have access to the internet. I think it's also making sure that they have the skills to be able to use it, and I think that it also does matter what kind of internet they have access to, and going towards the from the human rights, as the internet is a platform for the expression of human rights, having access to a certain type of internet, or only certain applications that governments have certain accesses to, or other things. That's not our end goal here with connectivity, and needs to be an important aspect. The other thing is capacity building. I think there are real legitimate concerns that governments have, that stakeholders have, that need to be taken into account. And I think part of capacity building is also just developing some common understanding about what we mean when we talk about certain issues. So I'll give an example of about maybe a year ago, I was at a conference where a developing country put forward a proposal on cybersecurity that was really scary for us, because it had just all of these, it basically was the Pandora's box of everything that we don't like countries talking about when they're talking about cybersecurity. And when we actually went to the country and said, of course, during our preparatory process, we're all freaking out and coming up with all sorts of conspiracy theories about what they could possibly be wanting to do by promoting such a thing at a global conference. When we actually I just asked the delegate, so, what is the problem you're trying to solve here? And they said, well, in our country, there are people that are using the internet to kidnap children and girls. And that is a real problem that our citizens are coming to us to try to solve. And so they had a proposal that was, about how you should change up certain technical aspects of the internet to accommodate this problem. But really what they were talking about was not a cybersecurity problem at all. It was a problem that is related to crime and how you protect children and use of the internet. And by just having a conversation about what you were trying to accomplish, we were able to address some of their concerns and talk through some of their options in a way that accommodated it, and then they were able to withdraw the proposal. Of course, that's not something that always happens, but I think oftentimes, particularly with, there are many, so this is probably not great for me to say, but I think that sometimes the UN is not a great place to go if you have a problem, because oftentimes you're asked to propose your own solution to the problem. And when you're asked to propose your own solution to the problem, sometimes people then misunderstand what your problem is in the first place. And so it's better to be able to have some of these conversations and increase capacity building. I think also this myth of a one-stop shop is also something that we really need to start to break away at. Not just a one-stop shop for capacity building, which a lot of people want and view the UN as, but also a one-stop shop for discussions. I think that there's also, in addition to fragmentation of the network, there is a lot of discomfort in our community, in our multi-stakeholder community, those of us that work on these issues. There's a discomfort in the fragmentation of internet policy discussions. There's a real proliferation of places that are discussing various aspects of internet policy, but also there are various entities and organizations that are just incorporating ICTs and internet into their basic discussions, because that's where how technology is developing. And I think that we need to embrace those kinds of things and not be fearful of them. So, like, for example, if healthcare providers, want to be talking about various kinds of ways that they can use innovation to improve healthcare outcomes, telehealth and e-health and various kinds of delivery systems, we shouldn't be afraid of the World Health Organization talking about that, or having various different kinds of consortiums talking about that. I think so a lot of us or if the Postal Union wants to talk about how to improve the cybersecurity of their systems, we shouldn't be fearful that, oh, this is another, aspect. We should be embracing those. We should be participating in them. We should try to bring those people into the fold and the organizations that are necessary. But I think that there is a real tension between those that really want to keep, we have all established kind of a common understanding of what multi-stakeholder means, how you address these solutions. But I think that it's a good thing that ICTs are cross-cutting across many, and the internet is a cross-cutting solution for many different things. I think we need to be comfortable with people, with various groups discussing this. I think, I guess one, as far as recommendations go, I think two things that I would certainly recommend are first, just having more quantitative data. I think we all talk a lot about the benefits of internet openness, but there actually is surprisingly little data that you can actually point to for why it's so great, why internet openness. I think a lot of us know intuitively that it is. The OECD is doing some good work that we've been involved with related to this. There are many initiatives, I think, that are trying to improve this. Boston Consulting Group has done some studies related to this. But I think that those kinds of statistics are going to be really helpful in making the argument to policymakers and various stakeholders. And finally, I guess, just from a government perspective, our plea to to other stakeholders that are not governments is really when we are, we talk a lot about the need, all of us, we're really, the United States feels firmly in multi-stakeholder cooperation. But it seems to us that when that the more, we've focused a lot on opening up discussions, and it seems that, the more that we once we have those discussions open, suddenly stakeholder interest in participating in those seems to decline. And then we move on to another place that we need to open up the discussion. And so I think that part of it is just, again, this proliferation of venues, and that it is hard to be everywhere at once. Like, trust me, I know it's hard to be everywhere at once, and often try to be, but I think that we need to be prioritizing, making sure that we're actualizing a lot of this multi-stakeholder cooperation and promoting various forms of multi-stakeholder engagement for governments in their own policy-making processes. But also, it's really important that once we have these venues, that stakeholders in their own right are coming and are participating, and we're paving the way for various different kinds of voices to actually come and show that they both care about these issues and add value to those discussions. Because sometimes that really is the problem that we run into, that we have a venue where, okay, it's open, like, come and participate. And then, other governments are like, well, you said that they would come, and, we only got a few contributions, and that doesn't help us the next time we want to open it up further. So I think a lot of the people in this room are participating and are doing a great job, but how we can get, all of us have to really challenge ourselves for how do we bring more people into the fold and ensure that that kind of participation is still happening. So that was a lot of things, but.
Yes, it was. Thanks, Micaela. I'll ask the remainder of the speakers to kind of keep your comments about 2-3 minutes so that we can also open the
Why don't we just open it to the group? Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, everything she said.
Plus one, as we say.
and then I'm sure Jeremy is very happy because Micaela called for quantitative data. So I'd love to hear from the rest of the room on this call to action as well, or anything else that you'd like to bring up.
Hey, how you doing? Thank you. I appreciate just sharing a few thoughts. First of all, I'm sorry. I'm Patrice Lyons. I'm General Counsel to the Corporation for National Research Initiatives. And the principals that I first started working with back in the 80s was Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf, who brought you the TCP/IP. And actually, we started the Internet Society. And we ran the IETF Secretariat for 15 years. The reason I'm saying this is that I want to remind another generation that we had a 10-year trademark battle to have the Trademark Internet Society accepted. Because they said the internet, and here from a trademark perspective, big I, little I, all caps, italics, bold, it is completely irrelevant. So after spending a lot of money and a lot of effort, we had an honorable settlement where in fact it doesn't matter. Internet is internet, put curly cues on it. All right, the second thing, had to do, I just had to say that because it was really important that, you were just saying, big I, little I, forget it. It's internet is the particular technology going back into the 70s as it was incubated out of the DARPA into the commercialization in the 90s. The second thing, if you want to, I have three things. The second thing had to do with end-to-end. End-to-end was never a requirement of the original internet. It was just an expedient way to get started. And actually, they didn't want to have the networks change their innards just to get started. But we've blown past that a long time ago. And especially as you're getting into the Internet of Things, where you actually have digital entities, that actually interact with one another and don't have location specificity. It's not required. And this now has become, you have the software interacting because it's a software environment. And sometimes you don't touch on a location. You just have this dynamic interaction of the software. The third thing has to do with, Micaela, the convergence. I noted in the that with the 2016, there was some talk about convergence. Well, I asked around and everybody can't seem to say that was involved in the internet for a period of years. Convergence took place at least 4 decades ago. Because what you had in the early internet was you had the packet radio, the packet satellite, and the ARPANET. And basically, if you look, especially I dug out a paper, and I'll show it to you. It's from 1975 for the old packet radio. And that was the forerunner to the CDMA, the little cell phones you have today. And the interaction of the information flows in that communication environment was actually the early internet. So if you want to actually move forward, I think it's important to realize that things have actually moved along and that convergence is not something that's going to happen. It's already happened. And so how would you deal with it? Don't dance OTT, bits on bits. I always like that when you have bits walking across bits. You have a converged, integrated environment that moves away from the layering and the transport to actually more dynamic units of information. So thank you for indulging me. I just wanted to share those points.
Thank you very much.
I think there we are. So I think there's an important thing that I wanted to pick up on, and it showed up in a couple of remarks that people made as well. So I think this is a nice opportunity to put it in. This point about both convergence and also the sort of erasure of the layer architecture is important for this topic of fragmentation as well, because one of the ways that the internet can fragment, and I think we are seeing it, is via enclosure. Right? So what we can have are systems that are running sort of, quote, over the internet. That is, they're using TCP/IP, they're using layer 3 and 4 and all the rest of that. But from end to end, from my little phone here to the server that I'm talking to the other Internet of Things device that's in my house or whatever, it's all actually a closed ecosystem. And I don't have any way into that thing. And if that happens, then what we've really created is an internet that is really just a transport layer, and maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's what we built, and maybe it's just a utility over which we're going to run these other kinds of services. That is one way that some companies certainly, and I think some governments are looking at this. That is, it's the same kind of competition when people are saying, oh, they want to use the quote standard as their regulatory wedge. It's really the same impulse. And if that is the case, okay, well, we built this thing, and now what you don't have is like, an open application layer or anything like that. Instead, you've just got this core thing that is the transport, and it turns into something like a virtual wire, sort of like the wires that we've got strung outside in order to get electricity to us and so on. Speaking as somebody who works primarily up in the upper layers of the internet, I'm hoping that that's not what we built, because it's not that much to be proud of. I mean, it was a great experiment while it lasted, but it's over in that case. And I think that that would be a shame. I think that it would be much better if we concern ourselves both with fragmentation, because people are trying to divide up the network into these little local things, but also to divide up the network into silos, and you can't sort of work between them.
Another comment, or anyone else would like to respond? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Jean-François Wettin, I'm a fellow with CEPII, a small Parisian think tank, economic think tank. And I really have two questions. The first one is about the link between globalization and the internet, because I think the two are like two fingers on a hand. We are seeing a rolling back of globalization. We are seeing that today. The day the president-elect prevents carriers from moving jobs to Mexico is the beginning of the rollback of globalization. So why should internet be then left out of that rollback if it happens on the trade front? And the second question is also, sorry, a very general question. Wonderful tool for human rights, and I congratulate you for that job. It's also a wonderful tool for terrorists. So when should fragmentation actually start? Because I can assure you of one thing, you can kick people of Daesh out of Mosul, kick them out of Raqqa, as long as one of them will have access to a computer and the internet. It will recruit people and they will blow themselves up in our cafes and on our streets.
Sure, thank you for that. Sally, did you want to respond to?
At least to the first question, I think you raised something that is certainly on the minds of many of us. I've been thinking of it in the context of sort of a rise of nationalism that we're seeing, particularly in traditionally democratic societies. We're seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it possibly in the United States, but not just there. We see it in some of the Asian democracies as well. And I think you're quite right that those of us who have been at the forefront of championing a global internet and seeing really the power, the benefits for individuals, for companies of this tool are now confronted with a very real populist or backlash of sorts. And I don't want to diminish that. I think there was an interesting piece. I'm sort of fixated on it lately, but in the New Yorker a couple days ago on the fact that Silicon Valley lacks empathy. This idea that things are being created without a real understanding or recognition of what it means to real humans. What is you create a new service that affects people's jobs. What is it, the beer truck that is now automated from Fort Collins to Denver? Everybody says that's wonderful for whoever wants to get the beer in Denver, but it's a problem for the truck drivers, right? I mean, people are looking at that and saying they're seeing their whole industry vanish before their eyes. So I think we have to be, I don't have an answer to that question per se, but I do think we have to be in the internet community really mindful of that reaction that's starting to happen. And that goes to the trust issues that I raised earlier. Do we trust the medium? But not just trust, are we satisfied with that? How do you introduce empathy into something that's ones and zeros and bits that don't have a face and a personality per se? I know it's something the IETF is struggling with is people bring sort of human rights considerations into protocols, and the engineers are saying, wait a minute, we're just doing protocols, but people are saying, but it has effects on real people. And so I think you're quite right to raise this issue of sort of a pushback in general on globalization that then affects the internet, which is kind of the epitome of globalization. I still believe fundamentally that the internet is a tool of I think, profound ingenuity and innovation. The people that Patrice talked about had vision in a way, and sometimes, and in some ways didn't. They didn't know that this was what they were putting out into the world. But I think it's not without cost. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we've probably missed something.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a little bit since the IANA transition, and I wondered, going around the Hill and talking to members of Congress on why are you so worried about this? They print the phone book; it's not that big of a deal. And it actually has a role in what you're talking about of anti-globalization. I think that there is a rejection by a lot of people in the United States, certainly in France, certainly in the UK, and around the world, that the global institutions that we've created to make the world a better place don't seem to be working for everybody. Yeah. The United Nations has not managed to stop war, has not managed to stop Syria. The United States has been at war for going on 15, 16 years now. The World Trade Organization has not made things better. I was in Indiana for Thanksgiving, and NAFTA has not helped a lot of the communities there. And around the world, people are looking at these international institutions, most of which were created after World War II, and saying, you know what, they're not working. So why are we giving them power? Let's break them down. Right now, we have 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are anti-UN. And if France continues the way it's going, it could be 5 of 5, which is a little bit of a scary thing in that the world is changing in a way that certainly we've never seen in my generation. I say all that to acknowledge the point and then push back that the internet is not a global institution that was created by world powers to solve problems. The internet was created by lots and lots of people who saw reasons to work together and make networks because it's great when we can talk to each other. So I would say that the internet shouldn't follow the nationalistic trend, the isolationist trend, because it's a different thing, and it also might be the cure to that nationalist trend. Because I don't think anyone thinks the world is going to be better off if I can't talk to people in Europe or I can't talk to people in China easily, cheaply, securely over the internet. I get that people might not want to make products and ship them from China because that impacts jobs and economy. But when we're talking about the internet, there is jobs and economy, but it's primarily people communicating with ones and zeros, but it's primarily people communicating to each other. So I think that would be the exception to that nationalist trend. And if not, I at least really, really hope so, because I'm trying to be optimistic lately.
Great. So we'll take the next question, please.
Thank you very much. I'm a member for UNESCO Task Force since 2000, and I would like to pick up on Sustainable Development Goals. You raised a lot of questions, and none of have answer to this. It seems to me it is not too idealistic. I attended the last annual meeting of the World Bank, where they evaluated 1 year later what happened with Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a huge mobilization. I don't know if you are familiar, so everybody's talking about it. I don't know how much we understand, but can we take this horse, Sustainable Development Goal, because the internet is almost not mentioned at all. Virtually no internet is mentioned in the document I have here, okay? Yet it's a fundamental infrastructure for education, healthcare, and so on. So it should not be done by Microsoft or Facebook, but how to organize a forum somewhere to see things, to discuss. Because it happened until 46 years ago, I was in a communist country, perfectly educated about it. And yet we believe that America will defeat the communist system because of values. But we saw also the results economically. So we will probably face the same situation again with China and others. They will close borders, but their people will see. And it will take time, and I'm convinced, but this is a personal opinion. But can we organize in America? I moved from Geneva to Washington, a forum to discuss further. The World Bank annual meeting, everyone was talking about many things, evaluating government from Germany to Uganda and so on. But internet could be, and this is my main comment, and I intend to push with UNESCO about this, could be an instrument, more or less neutral, technical, to see things further, that without the values you are talking about, and all of you take them for granted, without those values, we are not going to benefit. our Christian children will not benefit. But if I look to America, 5.5 million youths from 16 to 24 years old, out of school, out of job. Let's address this issue. The same situation, hikikomori in Japan. In Europe, we have the same situation. Try to address some of critical issues which cannot be addressed by China and others the way we do it. So to think this forum, to see how internet can be integrated in this, to make it happen. It's very short, 2030, the deadline. But it's very ambitious, and it helps us raise the issues which I was saying is coming from American government to China. Everyone needs sustainable development goal. Can you organize? It is too theoretical, and internet is a good instrument. Thank you.
Great. I think Cheryl.
So thank you for that comment. I think I have a new best friend in the audience. So to answer your question, I think you started by saying the word internet isn't actually in the Sustainable Development Goals, and I would posit to you it doesn't need to be. Everything we do with respect to the internet, everything that every company and organization in this room is doing, boils down to one word: people. There is nothing that companies are developing that will not directly impact people, for better, for worse. We could go back and forth on that, right? There are dialogues that are ongoing. I don't know if this room, I think some of you may be familiar with the Internet Governance Forum. It takes place every year in a different location around the world. The theme of this year's Internet Governance Forum actually focuses on the Sustainable Development Goals. And there'll be a number of different panels, a number of different workshops that actually focus and talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. This year, it's going to be held in Guadalajara, Mexico. I understand that not everyone can obviously travel, and that's why the locations are different, but you can go online and you can participate remotely. And so you can also get all the transcripts and participate in that way if you can't be there. There are also a number of other discussions that are ongoing. So for example, on the connectivity front, I know the State Department has been really active around Global Connect, and they've done a lot of different forums and work here in the US. I think they had another one, I think it was in India, possibly elsewhere. You'd have to look online. I can't remember the different locations, but that's ongoing as well. Another initiative that is recent and Verizon is supporting, and also I know Microsoft is a supporter as well, as One World Connected, and they'll also be doing events next year. They'll also have a presence at the Internet Governance Forum. Someone was talking earlier, I think Jeremy was mentioning the need for data. It's a data-driven project to look at what's working globally and where we need to pick up the slack. And so I would encourage you to look them up as well, oneworldconnected.org. But I really love your spirit. We could definitely do another conference. I'm all for it. But I think that's the right mindset for this entire room. We definitely need to be doing more and working together more. And you're right, these goals, they're not just aspirational. I mean, this is real, and there's real work being done. I mean, I know, for example, Microsoft is doing so much with respect to UN Women. They've got a lot of programs on the ground globally on that, and there is a lot being done. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't hear about it, and we always need to be doing more. It doesn't matter how much we do, we always need to be doing more.
So, Cheryl, I just want to make a comment on, sort of taking what you've said with the gentleman, what the gentleman has said, which is, what I'm hearing is that there's a lot that's being done, but it may not be the information may not be necessarily shared with the appropriate stakeholders. And so that's kind of what I'm hearing is you're needing to find out how to get this information to, going back to the well-informed dimension. I know Micaela and then Sally.
On that point, I mean, maybe it would be, most of us all are so active in the Internet Society in this room. I mean, maybe ISOC can be, I don't know, having, right, well, having, is that, something that lists, I don't know, where some of these things are happening for folks who aren't, I think ISOC already does it, but I would just, look at their website and follow what's going on there.
Sure. Micaela?
Sure. So I also wanted to address the point that you made in your introduction that Internet and ICT are not actually mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals. But And I think Cheryl is right in terms of how, they maybe don't need to be. But I also wanted to point out that there is another process another complementary process to the Sustainable Development Goals in the UN system, the World Summit on the Information Society Framework, which actually is, it was established in 2003 and 2005 and was reaffirmed. We had a 10-year review in 2015 and reaffirmed a lot of the same framework. And the goal of the WSIS process was to create a UN framework for how ICTs can support international development goals. And so back when it was created in 2003 and 2005, it was meant to support the Millennium Development Goals. And now that we have the Sustainable Development Goals and they actually occur, the 10-year review and the 2030 agenda were actually sort of occur around the same time, the WSIS framework is really supposed to be a vehicle for how you're going to measure how ICTs are supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. And you mentioned UNESCO. UNESCO is actually one of the WSIS action line facilitators, as are several other UN organizations. And the WSIS process is actually another great way to plug into how to track a lot of these things. It's another multi-stakeholder process that's related to the UN system that is very focused on how to achieve these really important international development goals and make sure that ICTs are supporting those.
Great, thanks. Sally? I was going to say, is the Internet Society going to launch a new initiative now?
Well, I do appreciate the public service support. I think in general, there is an important, Cheryl and Micaela have raised it, but prior to the Sustainable Development Goals, there had not been, at least in our opinion, as much focus by the development agencies on the role that ICTs can play as there should have been. And so bringing the development agencies into this conversation, because let's face it, that's where a lot of the infrastructure money that's going into developing countries is coming from, and you want the ICT component to be well thought through, to be consistent with where sort of technology is going. There I think had been some resistance for some time, that development needed to be purely about, water or education, and technology was just a superfluous thing. And now I think there's an understanding that, no, in fact, technology can facilitate education, it can facilitate environmental protection, it can facilitate health. So I think getting the technology piece integrated into the development agency work, whether it's the World Bank or UNDP or others, I think is quite an important step forward, and something I know the Global Connect initiative is focused on, and others that I think we're quite supportive of.
Great.
I'm Mike Nelson with Cloudflare, I handle global public policy issues. This has been a great panel, as have the other 3 sessions on net fragmentation. I wanted to add to Cheryl's public service announcement for the Internet Governance Forum, which starts on Tuesday. There's going to be 100 panels there, and at least 10 of them are directly related to this topic. And all of them are available, and Guadalajara is an hour behind us, so you can sleep in. You don't have to wake up early like we did when the IGF was in Hyderabad. The issue that I didn't hear you mention, and it may be because I came in late, is one that I think is fundamental, and that is the fragmentation we're seeing as different countries decide to reinvent the business model of the internet at the network layer. The best example of this is what's happening in Korea. They passed legislation 2 years ago, which is now being implemented, which is going to regulate how companies connect to each other. In the old days, it was very easy. My network connected to your network, we carried each other's traffic. No lawyers involved, no contracts involved. Over time, we needed peering arrangements, but what the Koreans have done is decided that they're going to regulate the cost of interconnection, and they're going to build a clearinghouse to count the bits going between all the different companies that deliver bits into Korea. This is a nightmare, and we're going to see it replicated in other countries. I see Andrew nodding his head. He knows what's going on here. How can we stop this before the idea spreads?
to be a little cynical about it, I think we should encourage Korea to go as fast as possible so that everybody else can learn from their example. I think, I agree with you that this is a disaster, but I also think that it's an unsustainable model because we already built this once before, and we spent most of the 1980s dismantling it in the rest of the world. So there is this fundamental thing, though, that I sometimes go on about. So many of you may not know this, but I originally studied philosophy, and I'm afraid that every now and then it shows. So you're about to see it. Just a warning. There is this really basic problem that the old-fashioned, telecom system only existed internationally by virtue of treaty. You didn't actually have an international telephone system or before that telegraph system until you had treaties, because that was how they worked, right? Each thing was a monopoly. It had to be. That was the way that network worked. And the problem here is that what people are gradually doing is trying to invent ways by which you can put internetworking into a monopoly sort of arrangement, by which you draw a boundary around the thing, and then you say, okay, well, here are the monopolistic edges of this. Now, my employer, Dyn, we spend a lot of time actually measuring networks and so on, and we spend a lot of time looking at the health of the internet. And in places where you've got very, very poor or small numbers or monopoly controls on the international transit in and out of countries, what you see are exactly these kinds of breakages. You get tight controls over exactly who can connect, and then those are the places that become obvious points at which you disconnect things. And so we see internet disconnection there, but we also see these kinds of, I guess I'll call them policy innovations. And it seems to me that what we're trying to do in that case is break the fundamental thing that the internet was supposed to solve, which was it was supposed to be cheap to interconnect these things. And what we're going to do is make it expensive. So I think that you're not going to be able to win this by arguing, that this is bad for individual players, because of course the point of the regulator in this particular case is precisely that, right? What they want to do is control the whole market. But what you can do is show that it won't work. And I think that the answer to that is fundamentally to get somebody to do it quickly and completely, so we can show like how badly it breaks the network. I think that that's the only way.
Sure.
Just to follow on to my public service announcement, the Internet Governance Forum is recruiting people to serve on its organizing committee.
Yeah.
I'm on the nominating committee for the technical community. So if you know some good people who can help explain technology to the people who organize the Internet Governance Forum, please talk to me. The deadline for submitting your name or somebody else's name is Tuesday.
Great.
You prefer if the other people know that their name's being submitted. I would, just to pile on to Mike's point though, there's a cadre of people that do this stuff and have done it for a long time. It's good to get some new voices into the mix and get some other people to carry the burden as well. You can look at it from two different ways. So, I mean, quite seriously, and getting some diversity into, the planning for the Internet Governance Forum, I think is quite important. I would just put another plug in for, there's the Global Internet Governance Forum, but the local and regional Internet Governance Forums we have found at the Internet Society to be very useful tools to bring conversations closest to where the decisions need to be made, which is kind of a fundamental principle of the Internet itself, right? Make decisions closest to the point of impact. And I know David Bjorst, and there are probably others in the room that are active in the U.S. IGF process. And so I think it'd be great to see more people involved, get some diversity, get some of these topics on the agenda that have been raised here, so we don't talk about the same old thing every year. So just to put that plug in there.
Great, thanks. And so in the 5 minutes that we have left, I can't believe that we're just kind of reaching the end now. I do want to turn back to the panelists and really ask for your expert advice on, so what do you think? What's your recommendation for the next step? Like just one actionable thing. And
Oh yeah, it's late for.
Jeremy, should we start with you?
Sure. Okay, one actionable thing. Wow. I didn't have too many, but it's still hard to pick just one. But I think the one I'm going to pick, you know, getting to the question, how do we motivate well-intentioned policy development? I want to share with you something, a lesson that we relearned here at the OECD during our work on the Internet openness paper, which is that when you're dealing with policymakers, messaging really matters. There was a lot of discussion about whether to pitch this work as the costs of fragmentation versus the benefits of openness. And what we learned was from policymakers themselves directly, as well as the people who work with them, is that it is far more effective to put things in a positive light when you're talking to them. This was counterintuitive for a lot of people, including me. I thought we could make greater headway and draw a lot of attention if we said, my God, look at the fragmentation, the costs are sky high, and this is a disaster, you guys have to do something. Wrong. They want to hear how they can help their citizens. So that's my main point is it's probably going to get you more mileage if you talk about the benefits from openness and the costs of fragmentation.
And that's really great advice, Jeremy, because I think a lot of us talk about, you know, what not to do as opposed to the more positive message. So thank you very much for that. Who would like to, we can move backwards this way. Nathan?
Well, I feel like I'm going to say almost the exact opposite. That while I hear that, from my perspective, a lot of what we do is stop the bad things from happening rather than how can we promote good things. Unfortunately, that seems to be the way of the world at the moment. And we're seeing an alarming development in what we call internet shutdowns, where for whatever reason, governments or telecoms under pressure from governments are just turning off the internet entirely for certain users, whether it's because there's a national exam and they want to stop cheating, or there's an election and they don't want evidence of fraud getting out. It seems to be increasing. It's something we at accessnow, we track at accessnow, keep it on through a global network of affiliates and friends and partners. And it seems to be happening more and more. And that seems to be the greatest threat to internet fragmentation, because if you want to be able to turn it off in your area, you need control over it in your area. So I would say from our perspective, rather than the most important thing to do, maybe the most important thing to stop is stopping governments from being able to turn off the internet and feeling like it's okay to turn off the internet.
Got it.
So otherwise, I agree.
One of the things that at Internet Society we've tried to do, and as picks up on something Micaela said, is it's rarely a constructive discussion to try to solve hard problems in the context of an international negotiation. That's usually the worst time to try to have a rational discussion. So to try to get out in front of that, we have tried to build a network of relationships, but also capacity building around the world that tries to bring the information in a non-threatening, non-negotiating environment or context to the individuals that are the decision makers. And the decision makers aren't always policy makers. They could be industry, it could be technical, it could be others. But that has been our approach. It's very difficult to scale. You know, the world is a big woolly place, but we have found it to be far more impactful than trying to do this in the context of when the decision is on the table and it's going to be made in 2 weeks' time.
Great. Cheryl?
So I think I would just say small scale, you said call to action, so small scale and large scale. Small scale, all of you here today in the room, if you've learned something about it, blog about it, talk about it, share what you've learned in another forum, right? And then larger scale, I think collectively we all need to be putting more resources, particularly into developing, least developed countries, be able to continue these conversations, to support different organizations like accessnow, Internet Society, et cetera, who are really doing the good work on the ground. I mean, we all can't be there on the ground, but there are others who are really skilled and who can, and so we should continue to develop those efforts and give them the support that they need.
Thank you. Micaela?
I think that inclusivity is really going to be important, and figuring out how we broaden the tent, bring in new voices, more diverse voices, younger voices, older voices, whatever it is, and also really try to work to bridge the technical and the policy. I think that was one thing that was alluded to. It's something that you know, I as a policymaker participated in a workshop that ISOC ran at an IETF meeting to try to begin to bridge some of that gap, and it's really helpful in terms of both distinguishing between, you know, content versus network architecture and public policy challenges versus what you can actually accomplish in technical. And I think the more we improve, the more we translate between those two groups of people, the more that we're going to be able to work together and solve some of these fundamental challenges.
Great, thanks, Micaela. Andrew?
So nobody has ever mistaken me for an optimist, and yet I'm sometimes, you know, I get to the end of these things and I feel very optimistic, and I do right now, because it occurs to me that this point about making the positive story the one to do is a good one. The internet, of course, is about connectivity nearby you. It's not about connecting to the entire internet. What you're connecting to are the things near you, the peers, and that sort of thing. And we can all do something about this. So, you know, if we're consumers, of course, we can prefer open systems to close things. We can prefer things that that encourage easy intercommunication of things, portable systems, and so on. If we're working in a corporation, we're making decisions about purchasing, we can prefer those kinds of things too. We can prefer open systems that depend on network technologies that actually permit easy interconnection. And you know, in our RFPs, for instance, we can specify technologies that implement open standards so that we're not stuck with the next generation of the same hardware from the same vendor the next time around. If we're making policy for that company, we can prefer open interconnection, for instance. So we can go into IXPs and prefer settlement pre-peering instead of the bizarre kinds of mechanisms by which everybody buys transit. And if we're if we're making purchasing decisions for governments or so on, we can do the same kinds of things. You know, governments often say, you know, I sometimes meet policy fellows at the IETF meeting, and they're, you know, what can we do about this? And I keep saying to them, you know, the biggest thing that you've got is your checkbook. You can make enormous differences in the deployment of a technology by just saying, no, we're not going to buy your stupid closed thing. We're going to buy this open one, and we're going to specify that, and we're going to put it in every RFP. If 5 governments in the world did that next year, we would see, you know, enormous embraces of open technologies. So we all have this opportunity, and it seems to me that that is the thing that we can each of us do at various layers in the internet.
Great, thank you. I want to give a huge thanks to all of our speakers, in particular to Jeremy. I am optimistic, and who's still in a suit and tie at 11 p.m. Thank you. And I am optimistic, listening to all of you, and in particular your last recommendation in terms of the call to action, because I feel that, you know, there is a group of very passionate people who want to move the conversation forward and to try to do the right thing with respect to addressing the issues, keeping the internet from being fragmented, and addressing the human rights and the various issues. So I am with you. I'm optimistic. Thank you, and I want to give the last word to David.
I think we could. Thank you all for coming. I think it's very important to keep these conversations going. We had a morning breakfast about the IANA transition with a few really good people, and people were asking how policymakers could misunderstand that so badly, and what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. And basically the answer is we need to produce 10,000 conversations like this all over the country and all over the world. We're going to try and do at least 4 of them.
Great.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you for coming, and please join us in the area. Just when you come out of the room, just go to the right where there'll be a little bit of food and a reception, and hopefully you'll stay to join us as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.